On the morning of the launch, when the sun had barely pushed its way through the thin fog, my son looked at me, eyes still glued to his phone, and said the words that cut deeper than any blade. "You'll just get in the way." No raised voice, no anger, just cold dismissal, casual as swiping a screen. For a moment, I thought I had misheard, but the silence that followed was louder than thunder. I stood there in the hallway, my jacket half buttoned, the old watch ticking on my wrist. This was supposed to be a day of pride, a father watching his son step into the light of recognition, a project reaching its final breath before coming alive. Instead, it became the day my worth was measured and found unwanted. My heart tightened, as if a fist had closed around it. I remembered mornings years ago when he was small, standing at the door begging to go with me to the site, tugging at my sleeve with eager eyes. Back then, he thought my hard hat was a crown. Today, he saw it as dead weight. I wanted to say something, anything, but words don't come easily when your very existence is treated like a hindrance. I adjusted my coat and pretended his words were nothing more than morning air, yet inside, something crumbled. He had spoken them without hesitation, like a truth he had carried for years. The car horn outside broke the moment. His colleagues were waiting. He brushed past me, the smell of cologne and ambition clinging to him, and without looking back, pulled the door shut. The echo of that slam rolled through the house, down the empty halls, through the memories hanging on the walls. Each picture frame, birthdays, graduations, family dinners, suddenly seemed like relics from a world where I mattered. I stood in the silence, my hand on the edge of the table where blueprints still lay rolled, forgotten from the days when every line I drew meant safety, meant shelter, meant tomorrow. My son had just told me the truth as he saw it, that I belonged to the past, that my presence would slow the future. He didn't know, perhaps he had never cared to know, that the very foundation he was about to stand on was held together by my calculations, my sweat, and the sleepless nights when I chose bolts over birthdays so he would never see hunger. You'll just get in the way. The words circled in my head like vultures, tearing at what little pride remained. I had been reduced, shrunk into an obstacle in my own child's eyes, and yet I knew something he didn't, something the foreman, the men on the ground, the silent bones of the building knew. My absence would echo louder than my presence, and so I picked up my jacket, not to argue, not to beg, but because I understood one thing: the day had not yet finished writing its truth. Friends, let me pause here for a moment. Please tell me in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? Have you ever faced something similar in your own life? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. By doing so, you help us grow this channel and bring more stories like this to life. And now, let's continue. He walked slowly down the path, his coat brushing against his side, his fingers curling unconsciously as though they still remembered the weight of steel. He looked down at his hands. The veins stood out like rivers carved by time. The skin was thinner now, but he could still feel the ghost of iron beams pressed into his palms, the vibration of drills, the sting of cement dust caught in every crease. Once, these hands lifted more than their share. They steadied walls before machines could finish their work. They tied knots and tightened bolts in the dark when there was no one else to trust. Now, the same hands trembled slightly as they leaned on a cane, and to his son, that trembling was all that remained of him. But he knew better. Memory rose, unbidden, vivid as breath. He was young again, boots sinking into wet concrete at dawn. The city was quiet then, the world still half asleep. The skeleton of a building stretched before him, skeletal steel ribs against the pale sky. He remembered standing there with no one watching, the first light striking the rebar, his breath clouding the air. It wasn't glory he felt, not triumph. It was responsibility, heavy but clean. That first project had been small by later standards, but for him, it was everything. He whispered a promise to himself. a promise that sank into the concrete along with his footprints, that he would build not for applause, not for names etched into stone, but for the people who would one day laugh, cry, argue, and dream inside those walls. He built so mothers could rock children to sleep without fear of cracks above their heads, so fathers could hang photographs without doubting the strength of beams, so families could trust a roof over them as life unfolded. That vow had carried him through storms, through nights when deadlines pressed like iron bands around his chest, through accidents narrowly avoided because he chose to stop and check what others ignored. He could still smell the sharp tang of wet cement, still hear the clatter of scaffolding, still feel the sun rising at his back as he stood guard over foundations that would outlast him. Every building was more than a structure. It was a sanctuary, and he had sworn to protect it with his sweat and his silence. And yet now, decades later, his own son could not see it. To his boy, those same hands that once held beams steady were now little more than relics. He was no longer the man in photographs on construction sites, smiling with hard hats tilted back and dust across his face. He had been reduced to an old figure leaning on wood, dismissed as a shadow of what once was. The irony was cruel. His son walked confidently toward a future that stood on the very bones his father had set in place, yet treated him as a burden, a useless presence that might slow the pace. The memory of that first dawn pressed against his heart. It burned and soothed at once. He thought of the footprints he left in the first slab of concrete, hidden now beneath tiles and furniture, but still there, holding weight every single day. No one saw them, no one remembered them, yet they bore lives without complaint. In that he saw himself. Forgotten, perhaps, dismissed, invisible, but still carrying, still holding, still ensuring the structure did not collapse. He flexed his fingers slowly, the tremor of age meeting the memory of strength. The cane steadied his step, but inside he walked as the young man once did, silent, resolute, carrying promises that had never broken. His son's words stung, but they could not erase what was already built. And though the world now looked past him, the truth remained in every wall, every bolt, every beam that still stood, because of him. The road stretched ahead, and with every step he told himself what he had whispered that first morning. I do not build for recognition. I build so others may live. And though his son could not see it yet, the time would come when those unseen footprints in concrete would speak louder than any voice. The morning air was sharp with dust and diesel as he reached the gates of the construction site. The place roared with movement, cranes swinging overhead, trucks grinding past, men shouting to one another over the clamor of engines. For him, it was not chaos but music, a rhythm he had lived by for decades. Yet now, standing at the tall steel gates, that music became a wall, and he found himself on the wrong side of it. The guard stepped forward, clipboard in hand, the routine question falling with an indifferent tone. Name? He gave it, steady and clear. The guard's eyes skimmed the list, finger moving down lines of neatly printed names. Then the pause, then the look, polite but firm. His name wasn't there. He tried again, softer this time, as though repetition might conjure recognition. The answer didn't change. There was no place for him on the paper that governed entry. No slot, no mention, not even a mistaken spelling. The gate might as well have been a fortress wall. And then, just as his breath caught in his throat, his son appeared, surrounded by colleagues, by investors with polished shoes and polished smiles. He moved with the confidence of someone about to present himself as indispensable. His eyes passed over the old man without slowing, without catching. Not a nod, not a flicker of acknowledgement. He simply walked through, the gate swinging open for him, as though the world itself bent to make way. For an instant, father and son were only feet apart. The father stood outside, the guard holding him back, while the son strode forward into the heart of the project. That instant stretched into eternity, and in it lived every birthday missed for overtime shifts, every holiday cut short by deadlines, every calloused hand that once built the ground beneath his child's feet. None of it mattered in this moment. He was invisible. The gap between them was not the width of the gate. It was an abyss carved by ingratitude, by ambition that no longer remembered its roots. The crowd followed behind, a stream of suits and hard hats, a current of progress that flowed past him, swallowing his solitude. He was a rock in the river, unmoving but battered by the rush of bodies and the hum of excitement that wanted nothing to do with him. He felt their eyes flicker toward him for half-seconds, not with recognition but with curiosity, the way one glances at an obstacle in the road before moving on. To them he was just another old man at a gate, a figure out of place among blueprints and machinery. He gripped his cane tighter, the wood pressing into his palm until it hurt. His breath came slow, deliberate. Pride might have demanded he walk away, spare himself the sting. But his promise, the same vow whispered at dawn years ago, held him still. He would not leave. He would not let the gate or the absence of his name erase him. He had built too much with his bare hands to be undone by ink on a list. Yet the ache in his chest grew heavier, the kind of ache that comes not from exclusion but from betrayal. For it was not strangers who had left him nameless. It was his own son, the boy who once begged to hold his helmet, who once waited at the window for him to come home from night shifts. The guard cleared his throat, uncomfortable now, uncertain whether to push the old man farther back or simply ignore him. But the old man didn't move. He stood in silence, his loneliness settling around him like a cloak. He felt it, thick, suffocating, yet he bore it with the same quiet endurance that once bore the weight of beams. The laughter of investors faded as they walked deeper into the site. The gates shut again, and with that final clang, he was left outside, shut away from the world he had helped raise. Still, beneath the pain, a flicker remained, for he knew what the others did not. He knew that within those walls of steel and stone, his fingerprints lingered on every plan, every calculation, every standard that kept men safe. The building itself, though still unfinished, carried his imprint, like the hidden footprints in concrete, long ago. Though the gate had barred his body, it could not erase his presence, and though his son had passed by without a glance, the day had not yet revealed all it held. The old man lifted his head, his solitude vast, but inside, a quiet certainty whispered, the truth always finds its way past gates. The clang of the gate still echoed when another sound broke through the morning hum. A whistle sharp enough to cut the air. The foreman had arrived, his boots striking the ground with the steady rhythm of authority. He moved through the site with the confidence of one who knew every corner, every danger, every face. The men shifted subtly, their chatter dimming, their movements slowing. Respect wrapped itself around him like a shadow. And then his eyes lifted, drawn almost unconsciously toward the figure left outside the gate. For a heartbeat, the noise of engines, voices, and machines faded. The foreman's gaze locked on the older man, and recognition carved itself into his features. The wrinkles, the cane, the stooped shoulders, it had all changed with time. But the scars across the knuckles, the way he carried himself even in stillness, the fire hidden in tired eyes, those were unmistakable. Memory rushed back, swift and overwhelming. He saw not an old man behind a gate, but the figure who had once stood above scaffolding at dawn, voice steady as he taught a trembling apprentice how to tie a knot that would not slip, how to test a beam with the tap of a hand, how to respect the weight of steel and the lives it carried. That apprentice had been him. He remembered the nights when storms rattled the cranes and threatened to tear half the site apart. He remembered the young foreman he had been, green, uncertain, almost swallowed by fear, and the older man who stepped forward, calm in chaos, saying nothing more than, "Check again." That quiet command had saved lives more times than anyone could count. Those lessons had stitched themselves into his blood, guiding every decision since. And now, seeing him diminished by age, excluded by his own son, the foreman felt something stir inside, a deep, unshakable loyalty. He turned to the men, his jaw set, his voice rising not in anger, but in resolve, carrying the same weight once passed down to him. "We're not starting." The words spread like fire through the crews, and in an instant, drills slowed, engines idled, cranes froze mid-swing. The site, moments ago alive with urgency, fell into stillness, a silence heavier than any order pressed down. The investors looked up in confusion. The sun stiffened with irritation, but the workers, all of them, understood. There was a rhythm to this site, and its heartbeat did not belong to papers or signatures. It belonged to the man at the gate, the one whose absence left the ground uncertain. The foreman's eyes never left him. In that gaze lived gratitude, memory, and something rarer still, reverence. He did not need to shout the truth, because everyone who had swung a hammer, tied a cable, or walked a beam under this man's guidance already knew it. The old man might have been locked outside by lists and pride, but to those who built with their hands, he was not expendable. He was the foundation itself. The sun bristled, his face flushing as he stepped forward, demanding explanations, pushing for schedules, reminding them all of deadlines and contracts. His voice, sharp and anxious, ricocheted against the stillness but found no echo. The men did not lift their tools. The cranes did not move. The silence itself had chosen sides. At the gate, the old man felt his throat tighten. He had not expected this. Not loyalty, not recognition, not this sudden halt of a living, breathing project. He saw the foreman stare, unshaken, unflinching, and behind it he glimpsed something more powerful than words, a memory that had never died, a lesson that had never been forgotten. The young apprentice he once guided now commanded the site, and in that moment he used that authority to honor the man who had taught him what building truly meant. The old man lowered his head for a moment, not in shame, but in quiet humility. He had thought his footprints were invisible, buried beneath years and dismissals. Yet here they were, alive in the stance of a foreman who refused to begin without him. Age had bent his body, but it had not erased his mark. And as the stillness deepened, pressing on the site like an unspoken law, he realized the truth. He had not been forgotten. He never could be. Inside the site's temporary office, tucked against a wall streaked with dust and sweat, stood a weathered chalkboard. It was not polished, not framed in glass like the glossy schedules the investors carried in folders. It was rough, smudged with years of notes, warnings, and reminders, scrawled handwriting layered over itself like the memory of countless days. But at the very top, written in bold chalk letters that no rain or erasure had ever been allowed to touch, stood one simple rule: no work begins without inspection by the elder. Every man on that site knew the phrase. It wasn't corporate policy, it wasn't stamped by lawyers, it wasn't printed on the laminated safety sheets pinned around the trailers. It was older than paperwork, heavier than contracts. It was a rule born out of fear, carved into their lives one night long ago when a mistake nearly claimed lives. He could see it as though it were yesterday, the scaffold swaying, the chain too loosely knotted, the beam hanging wrong in the dark. Everyone was eager, rushing against time, too blind to the danger until it was almost too late. He had been the only one who stopped, the only one who noticed the angle off by just enough to spell disaster. His shout had come seconds before collapse, and when the men looked at him that night, hearts pounding, faces pale under the floodlights, they did not see just another worker. They saw the line between life and death, spoken through the eyes of a man who had spent his life watching for the details no one else thought to check. From that night onward, the rule was born. It was first written on a scrap of wood, then on walls, then finally on the chalkboard where generations of workers came and went. No work begins without inspection by the elder. Some thought it tradition, others superstition. But to the men who had been there, and to those who inherited the story, it was sacred, not a word to be broken. And today, though the elder stood outside the gate with no place on any list, that line still lived in chalk, stubborn and unyielding. The foreman had pointed to it without needing to speak, and every man on site remembered. They remembered the whispers from older hands. If he's not here, you wait. If he hasn't checked, you don't move. Don't gamble with steel. Don't play dice with lives. The investors shifted impatiently, tapping shoes against concrete, glancing at watches. Deadlines weighed on them more than the silent rule etched in chalk. But the men, they would not lift a beam, not power a drill, not swing a crane. For them, chalk outweighed contracts. Chalk was stronger than signatures. Chalk was memory, and memory was survival. The sun felt heat rising in his cheeks as the stillness spread. To him, that chalk was just a relic, a scribble from the past. He could not understand how letters fading in white dust could hold more authority than his orders. Yet every worker's silence testified to the truth. The old man's inspection was not optional. It was the law written not on paper, but into the hearts of men who had once stared at death and been pulled back by his hand. At the gate, the father's eyes caught sight of the board through the open door. The words blurred slightly, not from age, but from tears pressing against his vision. He had not known they had kept it. He had not realized that what he had written in a moment of urgency had been preserved like scripture. His name might not have been on any guest list, but it was written in chalk across every heart that stood on that site, forgotten by blood, remembered by brothers. And in that moment, he understood. Walls could exclude him, pride could reject him, but no one could erase the law of survival he had carved into their lives. Even today, even as his son turned his back, the chalk whispered louder than ambition, "We do not begin without him." The investors, impatient with the silence, demanded to see the plans, as though paper could bend men back into motion. A roll of blueprints was unfurled across the table in the site office, its edges curling upward like a living thing unwilling to be tamed. The men leaned in, pointing to lines, to figures, to columns of numbers that most saw as abstract, detached from reality. But to those who built, every number was a weight, every line a beam, every equation a life balanced in ink. And then, in the corner of the page, under the official stamps and seals, someone noticed what the others had overlooked. 2 simple initials, small, unassuming, but unmistakable. They belonged to the man at the gate. The letters were not decorative, not meant for pride, but for accountability. They were the mark of an engineer who had spent nights hunched over a desk, recalculating load ratios until his eyes blurred, making sure no family would ever sleep under a roof that could betray them. Those initials carried the unseen hours, the sacrifices that had carved themselves into his skin and stolen years from his life. They were not just letters. They were ribs in the skeleton of the building, the invisible bones that held the project upright, the proof that his hands and mind were woven into the very heart of what his son now claimed as his own triumph. The foreman's eyes lingered on them, and in that instant, the blueprints were no longer paper. They were testimony. They declared what pride and ignorance tried to erase, that the structure breathing into existence outside those gates would not stand without him. Every calculation traced back to his pen. Every safe margin existed because of his stubbornness. Every reinforced joint owed its strength to his refusal to compromise. The building was already his voice, his presence, his unspoken defiance. The old man, though still on the wrong side of the fence, felt something shift deep inside. Forgotten in lists, excluded from ceremony, yet here he was, alive in ink that no one could scrub away. His initials had traveled farther than his presence. They had entered the veins of the structure, hidden but essential. And as the workers read the corner of the page, their silence thickened into reverence, for they knew the truth. The man the world had dismissed was the very one whose mark ensured the ground beneath their feet would never fail them. Rain had fallen hard that night, drumming against the half-finished frame of the building, turning steel slick and the ground below into a pit of mud. Deadlines pressed like iron shackles. The investors demanded speed, the managers shouted for progress, and the young foreman, nervous, eager to prove himself, had been ready to push the crew past reason. The beam, massive and unforgiving, hung suspended by cables that trembled under the strain. Everyone's breath caught as they rushed to guide it into place, urgency louder than caution. But then the old man, younger then, eyes sharper than the floodlights, saw it. An angle off by degrees too small for untrained eyes, but enough to spell catastrophe once the weight settled. Without hesitation, he climbed into the storm, boots sliding on the wet steel, hands bare against the cold bite of rain and metal. The others shouted, but he ignored them, moving with the certainty of someone who understood that lives hung heavier than deadlines. With one swift adjustment, he redirected the joint, resecured the knot, and shifted the load. For a moment, the entire frame groaned as though deciding whether to collapse. Then it steadied, the beam locking into place, the structure holding firm. The danger had passed, invisible to those who would later live inside those walls, but unforgettable to the men who had nearly seen it fall. The young foreman, wide-eyed and pale, had learned his greatest lesson that night, not in words, but in silence. He had seen speed nearly kill, and caution save. He had seen the value of patience, of the old man's unwavering demand to check again, even when the clock screamed for haste. That moment became his compass, shaping the leader he would one day become. And though years had carved new lines into both their faces, the memory of the night the beam held still lived between them like a vow. It was why, even now, with the world dismissing the elder, the foreman refused to let a single machine move without him. The sirens had wailed into the night, their cries tearing through the skeleton of the unfinished building, bouncing off steel and echoing in hollow corridors, not yet born into rooms. Men stood frozen, their faces pale in the flashing red and blue lights, as stretchers carried away what haste had cost. The old man had been there, his clothes soaked not from rain this time, but from sweat and grief, his hands trembling as he reached out to those left behind. Wives arrived with tears carving paths down their faces, children clutching their arms, their voices cracking with questions that had no answers. And in that moment, standing among the wreckage of ambition, he made a vow that would etch itself deeper into him than any scar. He looked at the widows, at the children who would never again feel the weight of their father's hands, and he swore, quietly, but with the kind of resolve that does not break, that no crane under his watch would ever lift a load until conscience, not clock, gave permission. No calculation, no contract, no manager's shout could matter more than the voice inside that whispered whether it was truly safe. From that night on, it was no longer about rules. Rules could be bent, ignored, rewritten. This vow was different. It became the moral foundation of his craft, the unseen beam that supported everything he touched. The men who worked with him felt the shift. They saw how he would pause, how he would scan, how his silence weighed heavier than commands. They trusted that silence more than deadlines. And slowly, what had begun as one man's vow grew into the culture of every crew that passed through his shadow. "Don't start until the elder nods," they would say, half in jest, but fully in respect. And though years blurred faces and projects came and went, that promise outlived them all. It was why his initials mattered, why his absence carried weight, why chalk on a board could hold back 100 men. The sirens had long since faded, but their echo lived in him, shaping every decision that followed, and though time had bowed his shoulders and stilled his pace, the vow had not aged. It remained unbroken, unbent, unerasable, for he carried not only steel in his hands, but the memory of lives lost, and the sacred promise that no wall would rise at the cost of another family's grief. The silence on the site became unbearable, heavy as the steel beams waiting to be raised. The investors shifted restlessly, their polished shoes tapping impatience into the dust, their whispers growing sharper with every passing second. Deadlines loomed, money ticked away with each idle moment, and the son, burning with the need to prove himself, stepped forward. His voice rose above the quiet, commanding, urgent, almost desperate. He demanded the work begin, insisted that delays would stain reputations, that hesitation would cost them everything. To him, the stillness of the men was defiance, an affront to his authority. But the workers did not move. The drills remained silent, the cranes frozen in their stance, like sentinels, awaiting a signal they recognized, but not from him. One by one, hands lowered, wrenches placed on the ground, helmets tilted downward in silent refusal. Their eyes, steady and unwavering, shifted as though pulled by gravity, away from the sun's flushed face and toward the figure standing at the gate. It was not orders that commanded them, nor contracts, nor the promises of investors. It was memory, respect, the vow that lived in their bones. Nothing began without the elder. The son's face reddened, pride curdling into shame that spread across his skin like rust creeping over iron. He felt the weight of eyes, not admiring, not trusting, but questioning. The men he believed beneath him turned away from his urgency and placed their loyalty elsewhere. In that moment, the foundation of his authority cracked, not with noise, but with silence. He realized that his name on the project meant less than the chalk on the board, that his ambition could not command the heartbeat of the crew. It was his father, dismissed, uninvited, excluded, who held the invisible key to motion. The son's words fell useless to the dust, while the men's gaze lifted only when the old man shifted, his presence speaking louder than all the speeches of managers and all the charts of investors. And in the redness spreading across his face, the son tasted what he had never known before. That pride, when struck by truth, corrodes faster than steel left in the rain. He did not stride onto the site like a conqueror, nor raise his voice to reclaim respect. He simply walked forward when the foreman opened the gate, his steps slow but steady, his cane tapping softly against the concrete. No one spoke. The investors watched with narrowed eyes, the son with lips pressed tight, but the workers, they straightened their backs as though an old ritual was unfolding. The father said nothing. He needed no speeches. His silence was older than their impatience. He moved among the machines with the instinct of one who had lived half his life inside their roar. His hand brushed the steel cable, fingertips grazing its tension. He measured its angle by sight, as though his eyes alone could weigh the laws of physics. He stooped, knees stiff but resolute, and checked the bolts at the base of the crane. His palm lingered on the wrench-marked steel, feeling not just its tightness, but its honesty. He lifted his chin to the sky, gauging the lean of the wind against the suspended weight, listening to the whispers in the air that numbers on a chart could never capture. To outsiders, it looked like nothing. An old man moving slowly, touching here, looking there. But to the men who had seen him before, it was sacred. They watched his hands, hands that had once tied their first knots, once stopped them from rushing into disaster. They saw him pause at a joint that seemed fine to all others, but tilted under his gaze. His fingers traced along it, his brow furrowed, and then he nodded for a tool. A single adjustment followed, so slight It barely disturbed the dust, yet in that motion lay the difference between almost safe and truly safe, between a day completed and a tragedy written in sirens. When he straightened again, his shoulders no longer seemed bent, but broad, as though the weight of the site itself rested quietly on them. The workers exhaled, not even realizing they had been holding their breath. And though he had spoken no words, the lesson pressed into every heart was louder than thunder. Safety was not in haste, nor in pride, nor in papers, but in the quiet vigilance of a man who refused to ignore the smallest detail. The old man gave a single nod, nothing more. But in that nod lived decades of devotion, lives saved and promises kept. And as the cranes prepared to lift, every soul on the site knew the work would stand, not because of signatures or schedules, but because the elder had checked, and conscience had said, yes. The air still carried the weight of his silent inspection when the foreman stepped into the office and returned with a worn folder pressed against his chest. It was not new, not glossy, not the kind of document that investors waved around to impress a boardroom. Its edges were frayed, its covers stained with fingerprints from years of use. When he opened it, the pages crackled with the stiffness of age, but within them lived the lifeblood of the site, safety logs, protocols, the rules that had kept hundreds of men alive when steel swung overhead like an axe waiting to fall. The foreman laid it on the table with reverence, and with one deliberate motion turned to the page that bore a signature, strong, steady, unshaken by time. The old man's name. It was more than ink. That signature was the root of the protocol they all followed, the reason every crane spin was logged, every load double-checked, every silence honored before the lift. Years ago, when the world rushed for speed and profit, he had fought for that paper, argued not with anger but with stubborn persistence, until his proposal became law for the crew. Men alive today owed their breaths to the words written on that page, and though it had yellowed with time, its authority had only grown. The foreman lifted the paper, holding it where all could see. The workers nodded in recognition, some even lowering their eyes as if in prayer. They did not need a speech. The paper spoke for itself. It reminded them that their survival, their families waiting at home, their confidence to step onto swaying beams, all rested on one man's refusal to compromise. That refusal was signed in black ink, unshakable, undeniable. The investors exchanged glances, their impatience unraveling into unease. For all their money and influence, their contracts could not command such loyalty. The son's jaw tightened, his face pale beneath the flush of pride that still lingered. He wanted to believe his name carried weight, but the truth was on the page before them, and it was his father's hand that had written it. The silence in the room became a verdict, a collective acknowledgement that no voice could outshout a document born from sacrifice. The old man watched from his place, saying nothing. He did not need to defend himself, did not need to remind them who had built the foundation of their safety. The paper did it for him. Each stroke of his signature carried the echo of nights spent awake, recalculating, refusing shortcuts, bearing the hatred of those who cursed him for delays, only to thank him later for lives spared. That paper was not a relic. It was the invisible shield that had guarded every man on the site, and it still spoke louder than orders, louder than pride, louder than ambition. And in that silence, as the paper rested on the table like scripture, all understood the truth. The elder had been written into the very bones of their survival. Nothing would ever erase that. There was no courtroom, no robes, no polished wood to frame the moment, no gavel struck to silence the crowd, no audience rose to applaud. And yet, in the stillness that settled over the site, it felt as if judgment had been delivered. The air itself grew heavier, pressing against shoulders already burdened by steel, and every man knew the truth. The work would not move forward until the elder gave his nod. No investor's threat, no schedule's weight, no command barked in desperation could loosen the stillness. The authority in that moment did not come from contracts or titles. It came from the undeniable history of a man who had once stood between disaster and safety, and whose presence still defined the threshold between chaos and order. The men lowered their eyes, not out of defiance toward the sun, but in recognition of the man who had taught them that silence is sometimes the strongest law. It was not rebellion they engaged in, it was obedience to a deeper code than paper could write. The son's voice had grown thin, lost in the air, while his father's silence grew thick, filling every corner, stronger than any speech. There was no jury, no prosecution, no defense, and yet the verdict was clear. His worth had been proven not by words, but by the unshakable loyalty of men who trusted their lives to him. The old man did not gloat, did not revel in the quiet that now bent even investors into unease. He simply stood, steady, as though rooted to the ground itself, and the truth of his place radiated without demand. Justice had not arrived with spectacle or humiliation, it had arrived in recognition, in the way hardened workers and young apprentices alike refused to move without his sign. It had arrived in the silence that weighed heavier than applause, reminding all who witnessed it that dignity does not need noise to be heard. And in that silence, the scales balanced at last. Betrayal had spoken first, cold and dismissive, but now recognition spoke louder. The son, trapped between shame and dawning comprehension, realized that justice had unfolded not in courts, but here, on the dust and steel, where his father's name had always lived. The truth did not need a judge to declare it. The truth already ruled. For the first time since the morning began, the son's shoulders sagged, his polished confidence stripped bare in front of men who no longer looked to him for guidance. The silence that weighed on the sight had broken something inside him: pride, arrogance, the fragile armor of ambition. He stood there, surrounded by the hum of machinery that would not move, and he saw his father not as an obstacle, but as the immovable center of it all. His breath caught, his throat tightened, and when he finally spoke, the word was softer than the dust drifting in the air. Dad. It was not a command, not a justification, not even an attempt at saving face before the investors. It was an apology, raw and stripped of excuses. He did not ask for forgiveness as though it were a prize to be granted, nor did he try to explain away his cruelty that morning at the house. Instead, he stood in the open, trembling under the weight of his own shame, and asked for something different: guidance, not approval, not validation, but the wisdom of a man who had carried weight heavier than beams, who had chosen integrity over speed, who had built not for glory, but for lives. He wanted to know how to see clearly when blinded by profit, how to stand still when pushed by the rush of deadlines, how to hear the voice of conscience when the world screamed for haste. The father did not answer immediately. He looked at his son the way he once looked at a foundation freshly poured, searching for cracks, searching for strength. He saw the boy who once begged to wear his helmet, who once stared at him as though he were invincible. Now that boy stood as a man, proud but broken, ready at last to learn. And in that moment, the old man understood that this was the first apology that mattered, not because it erased the wound, but because it came without masks, without calculation. It was born of humility, of finally seeing truth stripped of ambition's shine. The workers turned away, giving space to a moment that did not belong to them, but they felt its weight all the same, for they knew that no blueprint, no regulation, no protocol was stronger than the lesson passing quietly between father and son. A legacy was not handed down in speeches or inheritances, but in moments when pride bent low enough to listen. And here, in the dust and silence of the site, that moment had finally come. The father did not raise his voice. There was no fire of vengeance in his eyes, no triumph sparkling in his silence. He had carried too many burdens in his life to waste energy on pride, and too many nights of sacrifice to seek victory over his own son. Instead, he moved with the gravity of someone who knew that dignity does not need an audience, that truth stands tall without shouting. The foreman brought the inspection journal forward, its pages stiff with years of use, ink smudged by hands calloused from labor, each line a silent witness to days when safety and conscience outweighed haste. The old man stood before it, the murmur of machines still hushed as though the entire site held its breath. He took the pen in his hand. It did not tremble, though his body bore the weight of time. His fingers, scarred from decades of lifting steel and stone, pressed down with a steadiness that belonged not to youth, but to conviction. Slowly, carefully, he carved each letter of his name across the paper, the strokes deliberate, strong, final. In that signature lived more than approval. It carried nights when he had refused shortcuts, days when he had withstood curses for halting a job, years of unbroken loyalty to lives that would never know his name. The ink did not just mark the page, it marked the moment. When he set the pen down, he lifted his gaze, and though his face was lined by years, it radiated a calm that silenced even the restless shuffling of the investors. He did not look at them, nor at the foreman. His eyes turned to his son. No anger sharpened them, no scorn hardened their shape. There was only a deep, quiet strength, like the stillness of stone cliffs after storms have passed. And then he spoke, his voice low, almost gentle, but carrying farther than any shout. "Let the work speak for us." The words hung in the air like iron bells, resonating through the silence until they became part of it. They cut through pride, through impatience, through the noise of ambition. No one argued, no one dared. The son's lips parted as though to answer, but nothing came. His chest rose and fell with a new heaviness, as though something long hidden pressed against him at last, the realization that his father's strength had never needed approval, never needed applause. It had always lived in the quiet weight of what endured, what stood long after voices fell silent. The foreman gave a single nod, and that was enough. The workers, as if bound to the rhythm of tradition, picked up their tools again. Engines rumbled back to life. Cranes stirred from their stillness. Steel clanged against steel. Yet the noise did not drown the moment. It emphasized it. The site moved not because of contracts, not because of deadlines, but because the elder had placed his name in the book and spoken his simple truth. The investors shifted uneasily, realizing authority on this ground had nothing to do with them. The son stood motionless, watching the structure rise at last, his own pride dissolving beneath the undeniable fact that his father's dignity had carried more weight than his own commands. And the workers, hardened by sweat and danger, felt their confidence renewed, because the man who had once saved them in silence had once again spoken without needing volume. The old man did not smile, did not celebrate. He only watched, his posture steady, his silence louder than any lecture. That silence was the final word, the quiet verdict closing the dispute more powerfully than fury ever could. In it lived a lifetime of unbroken vows, of choices made for conscience rather than applause. And in that silence, everyone present, investors, son, workers, understood. They had just witnessed a kind of justice that did not need fury to be complete. The crane began its ascent with the kind of steadiness that only comes when every detail has been honored. The cables tightened, the massive beam swayed once in the air, then held fast, moving upward as though even the steel itself recognized the blessing it had been given. The men guided it with calm precision, their faces no longer tense but assured. There was no panic, no frantic scramble to meet a deadline, only a harmony between machine and man, the rhythm of work done with conscience. For the first time that day, the site breathed easily, and in that breath, The truth settled over everyone. This project had not been saved by contracts or investors, but by the presence of the one man who had been nearly left behind. Later, in the site office, the foreman placed a small plaque on the wall, not polished in gold or framed in marble, but made from a simple piece of steel, cut and etched with words that every worker could understand. We begin with conscience. Nothing more, nothing less. It was a law older than paper, older than pride, and now it stood where no one could forget it. Men who came to the site for the first time would read it, and though they might not understand the story behind it, they would feel the weight of tradition pressing into their bones. The veterans would make sure of that, passing the tale in fragments, until every new hand on every new beam knew. There was once an elder who refused to let haste bury safety, who taught them that strength means nothing without honor. The son, quieter now, stood apart from the others, his gaze fixed on the signature still drying in the inspection journal. He had thought himself the builder, the master of this project, but today had shown him otherwise. He realized he had inherited not just land, not just opportunities, but something heavier, a legacy of vigilance, a standard carved into chalk and signed into law with scars, sweat, and silence. And for the first time, he felt the weight not as a burden, but as an inheritance he was unworthy of, but determined to carry forward. In the weeks that followed, he began something his father never asked for, a scholarship in his name. Young technicians, apprentices just starting their journey, would be trained not only in calculations and machinery, but in the principle that safety is not a rule, but a responsibility. Each year, one more would carry his father's vow into the world, and the foreman, who once had been saved by the elder's steady hand, began his own ritual. At every new project, before the first crane spun, before the first load lifted, he would gather the crew and remind them of the law written long ago in chalk. Sometimes he would gesture toward the plaque. Sometimes he would say nothing at all, letting silence speak as it had that day. But always the work waited for the moment when he lifted his eyes skyward, as if seeking approval from a presence that would never truly leave the site. The old man's name was not etched into grand monuments, nor shouted in public ceremonies. His legacy lived in quieter places, in bolts tightened twice instead of once, in knots checked when the clock said to hurry, in the pause of a foreman's breath before giving the order to lift. It lived in the lives of men who came home safe each night, in the children who never heard sirens because someone had remembered the lesson of patience. It lived in every structure that stood firm, not because it was built quickly, but because it was built right. And so, though time would one day lay his body to rest, his presence endured, unshakable, unsilenced. His legacy was not a statue or a nameplate. It was in the lives that continued without collapse, in the roofs that held against storms, in the quiet vow whispered by men who understood what it meant to begin with conscience. That legacy was undeniable, unerasable. It lived in steel, in silence, and in the unbroken line between the first bolt he set and the last that would ever be lifted under his shadow.